Hi. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. So I am the co-founder of All Turtles, which works on a variety of AI products in San Francisco, Tokyo, and Paris. And back in January, I also became the CEO of Spot, which is a product that All Turtles launched about 15 months ago. And Spot is a tool that helps employees anonymously report harassment and discrimination at work, and then lets HR follow up without compromising anonymity. And I'm not going to talk too much today about the actual product itself, but I'm going to talk more about what the process of designing that product was like and what we sort of learned about building AI products from that process. So I'll talk about how we're using AI to solve a problem that humans just cannot seem to solve on their own. And I'll cover 3 pretty hard-won design principles for building AI products. But first, we're going to discuss the problem. Because without a specific problem, I think the technology and the sort of design that you're using to build your product doesn't really matter that much. And I think most of us are in tech because we actually want to solve deeply felt problems. We want to have an impact on the world for the better. And I think we all know that one of the problems that's currently top of mind is harassment and discrimination in the workplace. So even now, and perhaps especially in the age of Me Too, the statistics are pretty bad. So 65% of people of color have experienced racial harassment or discrimination just in the past year. 60% of women have experienced sexual harassment at some point in their careers. And 97% of LGBTQ people have experienced various forms of workplace harassment. So this problem affects a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. It is not a singular problem, and yet, at least 75% of these incidents go unreported. So you might say that we have a pretty systemic underreporting problem. And for companies, that means that teams are open to legal risk, productivity loss, higher healthcare costs, retention problems, PR disasters, and they can't adequately anticipate any of them because the problem is largely invisible. And then for employees, the consequences are arguably a lot worse. So people who experience this kind of thing at work tend to suffer from PTSD, blood pressure issues, insomnia. It gets bad. So what we asked ourselves at All Turtles is, if the consequences on both sides are so bad, why don't people report? Why are we having this problem? And it's not actually a mystery. There's been plenty of research done on this. We actually know why people don't report, right? People fear retaliation, which happens in about 40% of cases. People expect that they won't be believed even if they do decide to report. And people are often required to report incidents to their managers, and in about 79% of cases, it's the managers who are doing the harassing. And sometimes people are just embarrassed to talk to somebody at work about a situation that can be really emotional or traumatic. And there's one barrier in particular that I want to talk about today because it's the one that we at All Turtles realized was sort of the overarching barrier. It was like the problem, and it was something that we could use technology to address. Humans. The problem is humans. So all of us in this room, we are the problem. One of the main barriers to reporting harassment and discrimination at work is having to talk to a human. So your HR team might be amazing, right? They might be really well-intentioned, they might be really well-trained, but being human is hard. And being human in an organization full of other humans dealing with interpersonal conflict is even harder. And no matter how well-intentioned HR is, speaking up can be really scary. So we recently conducted a witness reporting survey, and one of the things that we learned is that 50% of people who witness an incident of harassment or discrimination do tell somebody. They tell a friend, they tell a family member, they tell the person who sits next to them at the office, but they don't tell HR. And we think that's because even when people do find the courage to speak up, HR is not always that great at listening. So as humans, we are all subject to some behaviors that make us kind of terrible at interviewing people about emotional events. So we're busy, we make people feel rushed, we get bored and stop paying attention, we might lead the conversation in a way that benefits us, or we might introduce our own bias, right? Did Lisa do this? Did that happen at the sales team happy hour? It's very, very common. The other thing that we do is interrupt all the time. If you ask someone to describe an emotional event to you, you often, on average, then proceed to interrupt them every 3 seconds. So, given that this is a people problem, or the actual problem is the people who are tasked with fixing it, the problem can feel pervasive and systemic and sort of basically impossible. But there's good news. I promise there's good news. And the good news is that there's a very practical first step that we can take towards solving it. We can remove humans from the part of the process where we are the biggest liability. And one of our beliefs at All Turtles is that we only use AI when it will help us solve a problem more effectively. So it's a tool in our product design toolbox. It's not a magic pill. And with Spot, some basic, trained, off-the-shelf natural language processing appeared to be the simplest way to remove human error and bias from the process of documenting incidents at work. But we didn't start with the NLP. We actually started with the cognitive interview, or the CI. So the CI is a scripted technique that's considered best practice for interviewing people about emotional events. It's primarily used in law enforcement settings. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the first time that it's been applied to a workplace. And the CI consists of a few parts. So you start by making sure the person understands the process and trusts you so they feel safe. You then ask them to tell you everything they can remember about what happened. So you ask them to freely recall the incident in an unguided way. You then ask follow-up questions based on their free recall. So the idea behind this is that you ask follow-up questions based on things they mentioned, not on things that you think they should have mentioned. So as you can imagine, this part is particularly susceptible to human bias. You then wrap up the interview by giving them the chance to revisit and edit their questions or their responses so that they're in control of the narrative. Now, neither natural language processing nor the cognitive interview alone was likely to result in a substantially better report than what HR could get on their own. We know this. So in order for the CI to be as effective as possible, we needed to have a machine run the script rather than a human. And in order to ask reasonably intelligent follow-up questions based on the free recall of the person who's recounting what happened to them, we needed to augment the script with NLP. So our running hypothesis is that AI is better than humans at this particular task. And so far, that seems to be mostly right. So studies we've conducted demonstrate that an AI bot gets more details from people, about 40% more, about what happened. The details are also higher quality and often more specific. And interestingly, this is the part that I thought that was the most interesting. People tend to prefer an AI bot over talking to a person or even using an online form. So, it has been a long road for us to just get this far, and we still have a lot of work to do, but we've also learned a lot along the way. And there are a few design principles that I have sort of noticed as a pattern as I'm working on various AI products at All Turtles, and I think they probably also apply to you, regardless of the kind of problem you're working on. The first is that good AI doesn't actually need to fool people into thinking that it's human. Its job is to perform a task that is better and to do it in a way that is often different than humans could. So until fairly recently, you'll probably remember this, we kind of had the opposite problem. All tech products sort of sounded and behaved like horrible, awkward robots. And so users were served up messages like error 405 or like server network failure, try again sometime. So as a result, the people who were tasked with making user experiences more usable went around saying, like, our products need to sound and work in a way that is more human. Our interfaces need to feel more human. But now the pendulum has swung really far in the other direction, and everything sort of sounds a lot less like a robot, but a lot more like a drunk teenager. right? There's a lot more delight, but not nearly enough clarity and precision. I'm sure some of you know what I mean. And with AI infusing UX in all these different ways, it's confusing and alienating when you can't actually tell whether you're interacting with a machine or with a human. And in many cases, what we've learned is that the user is actually much more comfortable with the machine. And with Spot, for example, we needed to make sure that it was crystal clear to employees that no human was involved in the process except for them. Unless they decided to submit a report, no person would see what they talked to Spot about. I mean, this is obviously a better situation for recording something that was embarrassing or traumatic, right? An AI bot won't judge you. It gives you as long as you need to talk through what happened. It listens without interrupting. It asks follow-up questions based on the things you actually mentioned rather than on the things it thinks you should have mentioned, thereby avoiding many of the kinds of bias that seep into this process. So our hope then, or hypothesis, is that an AI bot could make a fairly dehumanizing situation feel a lot more human. Building trust. Building trust is a big deal with any product, but I think a conversational product is one that largely builds trust through dialogue, and voice and tone were crucial to making sure that users trusted Spot well enough to talk to it about emotional events. So very subtle, very nuanced language decisions made a big difference in whether our product got used at all. So for example, we learned that Spot couldn't offer explicit sympathy. That felt to users like the opposite of impartiality, which is sort of what we were claiming to do. But we also couldn't come across as purely clinical, right? Running through a checklist of questions without acknowledging what the user was telling us. And after a lot of leveling up and down the bot's personality over the last year or so, we've developed a pretty carefully balanced tone. I think we are walking a very fine line. We're polite and accessible without being too friendly. We acknowledge people's experiences rather than just sort of coldly moving on. We don't use emoji because when we were using them, we thought we were using them to help de-escalate an emotional situation. But in reality, users felt like we were trivializing something they had gone through. And interestingly, like in reality, the thing that put people at ease was a voice that was simple, clean, clear, with well-written and properly punctuated dialogue, right? Who would have guessed? So now, 15 months later, if users are like having trouble talking about what happened, we might tell them, take a deep breath, because that's advice that's sort of proven to help people recall emotional events. But we're never going to cross the line into trying to be a friend by saying it's going to be okay. And in the same vein, we'll respond to their free recall of the incident by saying, thank you for telling me about that. But we will never say, I'm sorry that happened to you. It's a fine but distinct and apparently for us critical line. The third design principle is about training NLP inclusively. So we initially failed to account for the wide variety of misspellings and other linguistic variants that occur when people are typing up an account of an emotional event. So when we're upset, we type quickly, we make lots of mistakes, and we may not be in the mindset or frankly have the literacy level to know how to correct them. And one of the problems, I think, is that we started with a fairly homogenous team of 4 white people, 3 of whom have PhDs. And this was one of our resulting blind spots. We were focused probably too much on perfecting the product and thereby failed to address the imperfections and human frailty that enter into real use scenarios. So of course we've added to the training data for our NLP as a result of learning this, but we've also frankly hired with an eye towards inclusion so that our team now represents a variety of educational backgrounds and experiences. And in very tangible ways, that has made our product a lot stronger. I want to leave you with 2 pieces of advice from the design side of this whole situation. The first is that as you're designing your product, think deeply about how it will be used. recognizing the multidimensional humanity of your user, so the very human foibles and flaws and challenges that we all bring to every product we interact with will actually help you build a better AI. You'll never think of everything, but I think the important thing is to recognize your design mistakes as you go and correct them. The second piece of advice is to remember that AI is not an end in itself. Find a sharp problem first, then figure out what the best solution is and whether that solution involves AI. And in the case of Spot, we know that reporting is broken. So we're using AI to do that process better than humans are capable of doing it. And I think that can be a hard argument to hear if you're on the HR side, right? If it's your job to try to make things better for humans at your workplace. But I think, as people, we need to learn when to step aside and accept some help from machines. And in this specific case, AI can provide immediate and potentially dramatic improvements to a people problem that often feels insurmountable. And that, to me, is the kind of problem to build an AI product for. Thanks.
Well done, Jessica. Hey,
Thank
it's Jason. So many questions. If anybody has one, you can line up at the microphone. I'm going to start it off with two. I'm curious. I mean, obviously, Silicon Valley had a really, I would say, painful, difficult, perhaps even productive last couple of years dealing with these issues. So thank you for working on this and being part of the solution. But I'm curious, the resistance you faced when saying, I'm going to make an AI to deal, I'm going to throw technology and a bot at solving Silicon Valley's horrific, discrimination, harassment culture. And I'm fairly certain people would say this is like a Silicon Valley TV show kind of mocking moment. How did you get past that? Because you've obviously found massive efficacy with this tool. And what was the reaction when you brought it to HR people, and how did you get them to sort of turn a corner and take it seriously? Because it makes total sense in the review mirror as you present it today with many customers paying for this. But it must have been incredibly difficult to even introduce this concept.
Most of our customers are not in Silicon Valley.
So how did the Silicon Valley...
So I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is that most of our companies, or most of the people who use our product, the companies that use our product, they come from a wide variety of industries. They come from the medical industry, the financial industry, the government agencies. Silicon Valley, not so much.
What do you attribute that to?
I attribute that to the fact that we still, as an industry, need to reckon with the problem of underreporting. We still have a tendency to say, if I'm not receiving many reports of this, if people aren't coming to me to talk about it, then we probably don't have a problem and our culture is great.
So people don't want to see what gets uncovered. Final question.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right.
Did I understand it correctly? I'll just let the white men queue up to mansplain all these issues. Fascinating.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Can't wait.
A little humor to break things up. Did I understand correctly that people can engage the bot, report an instance, but then, discuss an instance with the bot, but then not report it?
That's correct. Yeah.
And then it's recorded and could be unlocked at a later date?
That's right.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Because that seems to me to be a very controversial approach. And how did you come to that? And is that something the HR people consider controversial? Because I would think, and I'm not an expert in HR, letting people talk about an issue but not addressing it would be very dangerous because it would build liability. I'm not an expert, though. You tell me.
I think what's been really interesting to figure out is that so many of the employees or individuals who go to Spot to record something that happened to them often feel a lot better after going through the process itself, and then perhaps decide that they're not willing to escalate it quite yet. So what we try to do is provide people with a safe space to talk through what happened that then provides them with a securely signed, time-stamped document that they then have for their records in the event that at some point they want to escalate it. And I think we've seen in very public cases in the last year or two that a contemporaneous account of the incident that happened to you would have made a big difference many years down the line. right? I mean, I'm talking about the Supreme Court case or the Supreme Court nomination process, right? If we had had a time-stamped account, a contemporaneous account of what had happened many years ago, things might have been different.
What if there's a serial offender in a company, they've been reported 7 times, does Spot tell people, hey, or they haven't been reported, but people have interacted with Spot and said, Emmy Award-winning producer Jackie's just been incredibly harassing to me, I can't take it anymore, but we never actually surface that information, or does it tell them, hey, you might want to talk to this person, but we're not ready to reveal anything? Has there been any talk about that? Because that could be super dangerous. If 7 people report somebody, but they're not, or 7 people record it, but don't report it.
Well, I mean, we have to remember that the emphasis should be on the person who actually experienced the thing. It should be up to them whether they want to share their story.
What about if there's a large number of them reporting somebody and then it doesn't go through? Then there's a missed opportunity to correct the situation for the 8th, 9th, and 10th person.
I think that's right. And so one of the things that we are doing is creating a way for HR to follow up with people without compromising their anonymity. So I think one of the things that's really scary about speaking up is that a tremendous number of reports end in retaliation, right? So if HR knows who you are, or if your manager knows who you are and that you reported something, you are quite likely to be retaliated against. So what we are trying to do is make it safe for people to speak up in order to combat this problem of underreporting. And that means allowing people to stay anonymous while still helping facilitate HR asking follow-up questions so that they can get the details they need to actually deal with the report.
So there's somewhere between, anonymously documenting, reporting, that could be a safer space of, hey, we can have a dialogue anonymously and then figure out what your concerns are.
Right,
not
we
hitting the report
facilitate
button.
interaction between HR and the person reporting that allows them to stay anonymous.
That's brilliant. Okay, let's take 2 questions, concise questions from our...
I guess this doesn't apply to you, single concise question restriction.
Ask me. Oh no, never applies to the host.
Okay,
yes,
since you're organizer, you're exempt from that.
Security, have this guy.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I am also in the speech field, and typing is not a natural interaction that we do as humans. I wonder if you have an insight into adding speech-to-speech interaction to this bot and how that may play into the things. I'm just as a general...
No, we have thought about that in order to make the product a lot more accessible. I think it's going to be really, really important. One of the things that we've built into the product over the last quarter is a large number of accessibility settings, and I would like for us to have better speech-to-text capabilities, meaning not just the ones that come with your device. That's a good point. What's that?
Oh, he said emotion is something you could add to that, I guess.
Yeah.
But you said earlier being emotional versus, you maybe don't want to be in your best practices overly friendly, you want to be a little more...
That's right. No,
middle of the road.
Exactly. We try to maintain a level of objectivity that doesn't feel sort of overly rational or cold.
So my question is, the Stanford Design School taught us that empathize is an important part of any product development cycle. And this is a situation where the very target population are people who don't want to be talking about what they're talking about. So what on earth does a focus group or a UX or a UI cycle look like? And how did you come up with the data about tone, for example, since all these people really didn't want to be talking to you in the first place, theoretically?
That's right. I mean, we do user testing, right? So we recruit people who have experienced incidents of harassment or discrimination at work and are willing to come in and try the product and let us know how they feel. Because I think you're exactly right. Empathy is incredibly important. And in the case of Spot, what empathy actually means is not being too warm or too friendly, right? So empathy means vastly different things depending on the context. And in this case, having empathy for the user means understanding that they don't want you to feel overly human. They want to know that they're talking to a machine and they want to feel like it's a machine.
But that's something you discovered in the process, right?
That's right. Okay. That was not intuitive to me at all, yeah.
Okay, we'll take another question from a white dude. Go ahead.
Just really quickly, fascinating to be approaching this problem using AI, and it's a deeply human problem. Are there things that you've learned in this design process about how we can show up better as managers and as colleagues and as allies?
Yes. There are three things that companies and managers can do that if we actually do them, we do them effectively, harassment and discrimination will drastically reduce. So the first one is to give people many options of who to report to. The second one is to have a strong anti-harassment policy and make sure it's communicated broadly and that people understand it. The third is to give people an anonymous reporting tool. I'm not making this up. This is not our research. This is completely external academic research. Yeah, and the other thing is to train your managers. Managers are by far the biggest perpetrators. And so we need people who are in positions of power to know how to wield that power.
Okay, let's take a quick final question.
Hi. Just curious if you've thought about expanding into similar use cases. Like seeing your presentation made me think of the whistleblower need at public companies. Sarbanes-Oxley compliance requires, right, the ability to disclose irregularities without fear of retribution.
Oh, definitely. We're actually looking into a use case that is very similar to that right now, because I think one of the things that we've realized is that we're not going to solve the underreporting problem just with a tool that is built for the heaviest possible case, right? So yes, if harassment or discrimination has happened to you, that's terrible, and you need a thorough way to document and report it safely. But there are all kinds of other things that happen in workplaces every day that also need to be surfaced and reported, and many of those are things that, if left unresolved, will lead to incidents of harassment and discrimination. So we are thinking about how to expand the tool to include reporting of different kinds of issues. Yeah.
Back to the sort of middle ground between reporting and documenting. Is there, or have you considered, I'm sure it must have come up in ideation, creating a platform where people could report and somehow information could get back to the person who's either clueless or evil about their behavior? In other words, if my company doesn't have Spot, could there be Spot on the web like Glassdoor, where you could report something that happened to you, even if my company doesn't use Spot, and then maybe put in the email addresses of the offender and/or HR person and let them kind of consume the general data there? Or is that too much liability for you? I'm curious.
That exists. So Spot was launched initially in February of 2018 as a tool for end users only. So we didn't start, we started working on the company product after that and started selling it in beta in October of last year. It will always be free and freely accessible for individuals to access the tool online and create a report and then decide whether or not they want to submit that report to their organization. If someone whose company does not yet use Spot creates a report and sends it to them, their company can sign up for a free trial in order to ask follow-up questions without compromising that person's anonymity. Yeah.
Right, and they don't have to buy the product.
That's right.
They
don't have to buy the product to see the report. They don't have to buy the product to follow up. That is not the precedent that we want to set.
It's not an onboarding strategy, or
no.
Yeah. It's a strategy to make the world better.
We want, right. I mean, we obviously are trying to build a self-sustaining business, but Spot will always be free for individuals, and companies will always be able to use it for free to follow up on reports that they get from individuals, even if they don't yet pay for it or use it. Yeah.
Amazing. If you can get us if you can get somebody to leak the Mueller report, we'd appreciate that. We need those 18 pages. Okay.
Similar but different problems, yes.
Yeah, similar but different problems. All right, let's give it up for Jessica. Well done. Amazing.